Earlier today, behind closed doors, the House Intelligence Committee considered amendments to the controversial Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act, also known as CISPA. The bill aims to bolster cybersecurity measures by facilitating data sharing between private companies and government agencies, but it's raised concerns about how personal information would be used by those agencies. So will today's adjustments be enough to alleviate fears before the legislation goes to a full vote next week in the House? Joining me for tonight's Q&A is Bill Gertz. He's the senior editor of the Washington Free Beacon and the national security columnist for the Washington Times. Bill, welcome.
Hi, Amy. Good to be
have you once again. So I understand the House, the Intelligence Committee, rather, met in secret in the basement of the Capitol Visitor Center so they could consider some potentially top secret aspects of cybersecurity. I want to ask you, your own Sean Waterman of the Washington Times reported that Congress hasn't passed a piece of legislation, hasn't turned it into law in 5 years that would address cybersecurity. How will this bill that's under consideration do that?
Well, it's not clear how it's going to do that. This is a classic debate between government and the private sector over what's the best way to deal with a security problem. At issue is privacy, individual liberty, and most importantly, internet freedom. The government is looking at ways to try and solve the problem of massive cyber attacks, and they want access to private sector data. The real problem here is that the Obama administration has adopted a passive defense strategy against cyber attacks, and that's really a losing strategy. The only way to solve this problem is to counterattack, to go against the Chinese military when they're detected hacking into our computers, our networks, both government and private.
So when cybersecurity experts talk about sharing data between the private sector and government agencies, what does that mean? What does that entail exactly?
Well, it's, this is the whole issue of big data. I mean, most of the big data today is held in private hands, and that is a really valuable commodity. It's becoming a much more useful tool for government to do everything from counterintelligence to companies doing marketing and research. And the question is, who owns your private data, and should that private data be shared with the government? And of course, that's a really bad idea. The government really can't be trusted, in my view, to be able to handle private data or even have access to it. There's always levels of abuse, and clearly, this is something that should be a concern for everyone that's concerned about individual liberty and, as I say, internet freedom, really the last frontier of freedom.
Bill, it's interesting that you make that point. I've seen some critics that say this House bill would have that private data go directly to the NSA, which is a very secretive organization, and it wouldn't have oversight, and instead it should go to the Department of Homeland Security. But as you mentioned, that has potential for abuse as well. It's still another branch of government, even if it has greater oversight. I want to bring your attention to a hacker turned cybersecurity expert who wrote an op-ed in the New York Times last week who said that, quote, Congress should harness the power of the private sector through flexible and non-regulatory solutions. So basically sort of encouraging private companies to do this through perhaps even reform of cybersecurity liability and insurance and make them liable for cybersecurity lapses. What do you think about that approach?
That may not be the best solution. On the other hand, a lot of the corporations that have been attacked, specifically by the Chinese, have been clamoring and complaining to the government that the government needs to do something, to step in and do something about these attacks. So it's clearly a debate that hasn't been resolved. And like I say, a number of companies are lining up on either side of it, big companies against and for this CISPA bill.
All right. Bill Gertz, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.